Everyone knows the story of Pearl Harbor, the day a surprise carrier attack changed naval warfare forever. But what if I told you the Japanese didn't invent that tactic? What if I told you they copied it? 13 months earlier, on a cold November night in 1940, 21 British pilots climbed into hopelessly obsolete fabric-covered biplanes. Their target, the entire Italian battle fleet, hiding in a harbour that every naval expert on Earth agreed was completely impenetrable. It looked like a suicide mission. But over the next 2 hours, those 21 outdated planes didn't just sink an empire's navy. They rewrote the rules of war. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we are covering the Battle of Taranto. But before we get to those 21 aircraft and the darkness above Taranto, we need to understand why the Italian fleet sitting in that harbour mattered so much, and why destroying it without destroying it first was the more dangerous option. Italy entered the war on June 10th, 1940, 6 days before France collapsed. The timing was deliberate. Mussolini had watched Germany tear through Western Europe and wanted to claim his share of the spoils before there was nothing left to claim. For Britain, Italy's entry was a strategic catastrophe of the first order. The Italian Navy, the Regia Marina, sat directly astride the supply route that connected Gibraltar to Malta, to Alexandria, to the Suez Canal. Everything that kept the British position in North Africa and the Middle East functioning ran through that corridor. The Italians, with their geographical position and their substantial fleet, could threaten all of it. What made the situation more complicated was what the Italian Navy chose to do with this advantage. Almost nothing. The Regia Marina strategy was what naval planners call fleet in being, keeping the fleet intact and in harbour, where its mere existence constrained British operations without requiring it to risk destruction in open battle. The Italian admirals understood correctly that they could not afford to lose ships they couldn't replace. Their industry couldn't build fast enough. Their fuel reserves were limited. Their air cover was provided by the Italian Air Force rather than naval aviation, and the coordination between the two services was poor enough to be dangerous. So the fleet stayed in Taranto. It didn't fight. It just sat there threatening. Admiral Andrew Cunningham, commanding the British Mediterranean fleet from Alexandria, found this arrangement maddening and dangerous in equal measure. The Italian fleet didn't need to fight to be effective. Its presence forced British convoys onto longer routes, tied up British warships on escort duty, and created a constant strategic pressure that accumulated over months. The answer, Cunningham and the Admiralty agreed, was to hit the fleet in harbour, to go to Taranto and destroy the Italian battle line before it had any opportunity to use itself. The plan had actually existed since 1935, when a previous Mediterranean commander had asked his staff to prepare a study of exactly this kind of attack. Rear Admiral Lister, who had been involved in those early studies and was now commanding the carrier force aboard HMS Illustrious, dusted off the concept and brought it to Cunningham. The target was Taranto. The weapon was the swordfish. The fairy swordfish was, by any reasonable assessment of 1940 aviation, a relic. It had entered service in 1936. Its fabric-covered double-wing construction belonged to the previous decade, when modern aircraft, German Messerschmitts, Italian Macchis, British Spitfires, were cruising at 300 or 400 miles an hour. The swordfish carrying a torpedo managed 100. It was slow, it was ungainly, and it looked like something built specifically to be shot down. What the swordfish had, which saved it at Taranto, was a set of accidental advantages that its designers had never intended. Anti-aircraft guns are calibrated for the speed of their targets. Italian gunners had trained to lead fast-moving aircraft, to place their shells where the plane would be a few seconds after they fired. The swordfish was so slow that the layered calculations put the shells comfortably ahead of where the aircraft actually was. The swordfish flew through the spaces the shells were missing. The fabric covering had a similar effect. Modern aircraft had metal skins. Explosive shells were designed to detonate on contact with them. A shell that pierced linen and struck nothing rigid enough to trigger detonation simply passed through. Swordfish returned from Taranto with holes in their wings that would have been fatal to a metal aircraft, but the old biplanes kept flying, and the swordfish could fly very slowly indeed, slowly enough to drop to 30 feet above the harbour water, release a torpedo, and pull away without the weapon having time to dive too deep. This last quality was the one that made Taranto possible at all. The conventional wisdom of 1940 held that torpedo attacks required water at least 75 feet deep. Torpedoes, when released from aircraft, plunged before levelling out, and in shallow water, they hit the bottom before they could find their depth and run true. Taranto harbour was 40 feet deep. The Italians knew this. They believed it made them invulnerable to aerial torpedo attack. They were wrong. British engineers had solved the shallow water problem with a mechanism of almost elegant simplicity. A drum was mounted on the underside of the swordfish fuselage, with a wire that ran from the drum to the nose of the torpedo. When the torpedo was released, the drum paid out wire that held the torpedo's nose up as it hit the water, preventing it from nosediving to the bottom, allowing it to level out and run true in just over 30 feet of water. The Italian fleet's greatest protection was nullified by a spool of wire. There was a second modification. The torpedoes were fitted with duplex pistols, magnetic fuses that detonated not when the weapon struck the ship's armoured side, but when it passed beneath the hull and detected the magnetic field of the ship itself. The explosion went off directly under the keel, where there was no armour. The physics of an underwater explosion directly beneath a ship are quite different from one on the side. The upward force ruptures the bottom, floods compartments, and in severe cases, breaks the keel itself. The attack was planned for October 21st, Trafalgar Day. The date appealed to the Admiralty's sense of occasion. It was delayed by technical problems, then by a hangar fire aboard Illustrious that destroyed 2 aircraft and damaged others. The attack was rescheduled for the night of November 11th, with a second carrier, HMS Eagle, having been damaged in earlier operations and reduced to contributing 5 of its most experienced aircraft and crews to the Illustrious force. 21 aircraft in total, 11 carrying torpedoes, 10 carrying bombs and flares. The Italian defences at Taranto were, on paper, formidable. 101 heavy anti-aircraft guns, barrage balloons strung on cables to shred low-flying aircraft, torpedo nets around the battleships, sound detection equipment that could hear approaching aircraft at 30 miles. What the Italians did not have was radar, which meant the sound equipment gave them warning, but not accurate targeting data. What they also did not have was night fighters, aircraft capable of intercepting attackers in darkness. And a storm 10 days earlier had torn away 60 of the 90 barrage balloons, leaving gaps wide enough for the swordfish to fly through. The first wave of 12 aircraft launched from Illustrious at 8:40 p.m. They flew in the dark, over the sea, in open cockpits in November. Navigation was by stars. They reached Taranto just before 11. The flare droppers went in first, circling east of the harbour and releasing parachute flares that lit the anchorage from behind, silhouetting the anchored warships against the light so that the torpedo aircraft coming in low from the west could see their targets clearly. Then the guns opened up, and the sky over Taranto became a grid of tracer and shell bursts that looked, to those watching from a distance, like a fireworks display of extraordinary violence. The torpedo aircraft came in at 30 feet, flying under the balloon cables, weaving between the gun positions, targeting the battleships one by one. Lieutenant Williamson in the lead aircraft lined up on the Conte di Cavour, released his torpedo and pulled away. The wire and drum mechanism worked. The torpedo ran shallow and true. It detonated under the keel. Williamson's aircraft was hit by anti-aircraft fire a second later and crashed into the harbour. He and his observer were pulled out alive by Italian sailors and spent the rest of the war as prisoners. The Conte di Cavour was sinking. The Littorio, Italy's newest and largest battleship, was hit by 2 torpedoes in the first wave. The Caio Giulio was hit once. 7 French guns were abandoned on the hillside as 2 attacks pressed home under continuous anti-aircraft fire that filled the sky, but could not stop aircraft flying at 100 miles an hour through the gaps in its geometry. The second wave arrived 90 minutes later. The surprise was gone. The guns were ready. The barrage was heavier. The Littorio was hit by a 3rd torpedo. By this point she was taking on water faster than her pumps could handle. Lieutenant Bailey and his observer were killed when their aircraft was hit and went into the harbour. They were the only British fatalities of the night. By the time the surviving aircraft were back aboard Illustrious, 19 of 21, The losses heartbreakingly small given what they had flown into. The damage assessment was beginning to come through. The Conte di Cavour had sunk to the bottom of Taranto harbour, only her upper works above water. The Littorio was beached to prevent her sinking. The Caio Duilio was beached with a hole in her hull that her crew was still trying to understand. 3 of Italy's 6 battleships were out of action. Half the Italian battle fleet had been removed from the war in a single night, at a cost of 2 aircraft and 2 men. Cunningham sent a signal to the Admiralty that has the quality of controlled satisfaction. A commander who has achieved exactly what he intended and knows it. The Italian fleet responded by moving its remaining battleships north to Naples and La Spezia, well out of range of British air attack. The threat that had been constraining British operations in the Mediterranean for 5 months simply removed itself. The supply route through the Mediterranean opened. The pressure on Malta eased. The strategic calculation that had made the Italian fleet useful, even in harbour, was destroyed in 2 hours. What happened next is the part of the Taranto story that most people don't know. Within days of the attack, a Japanese naval attaché named Lieutenant Commander Takeshi Naito was in Taranto, walking the docks, examining the damage, measuring the harbour, taking notes. Japan had been watching the development of carrier aviation with intense interest. The question of whether an aerial torpedo attack could work in a shallow harbour, the question that had seemed to answer itself with a firm no, had now been answered differently by 21 fabric-covered biplanes on a November night. Naito's report went to the planners of the Japanese carrier force. They studied it. Their engineers solved the shallow water torpedo problem independently, not with wire and drum but with wooden fins attached to the torpedo tail that shattered on water entry, slowing the plunge. They tested the solution in harbours of similar depth. By the autumn of 1941, they had a weapon and a plan and a target. The target was Pearl Harbor. The harbour was 40 feet deep. The attack came on December 7, 1941, with 353 aircraft from 6 carriers. The Americans at Pearl Harbor knew about Taranto. A report had been filed, urgent and detailed, by an American naval observer who had actually been aboard Illustrious during the attack. The report reached Washington. It was filed. The lesson it contained, that shallow harbours were not protection against aerial torpedoes, was absorbed by the bureaucracy and not transmitted to the Pacific Fleet. When the Japanese arrived, the American battleships were sitting in 40 feet of water, and the Japanese torpedoes were modified for exactly that depth. The men who flew into Taranto in fabric biplanes on a November night in 1940 could not have known what they were demonstrating. They were trying to remove a threat to British supply lines in the Mediterranean. They succeeded completely, but the method they used, the carrier strike, the night attack, the shallow water torpedo, had consequences that extended far beyond Taranto harbour. It showed the world in blood and fire and sinking ships that battleships in harbour were not safe from aircraft, that the age which had been built around big guns and heavy armour and the fleet action between capital ships was ending, that the future of naval power would be decided in the air. It took 21 old biplanes one night to prove it. That is what happened at Taranto.